Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Cifuentes, and the Peruvian Society of Logic and Epistemology for this invitation and for this conference. I thought that the theme on Newton da Costa and the modal status of logic would be quite appropriate for this discussion on heterodoxy in logic and reason, because that's a theme that da Costa touches on very much. I apologize for not being speaking in Spanish, but as I mentioned it, I'm really not good at that. And I also apologize in advance for not delivering exactly what was in the abstract. As I noticed it in preparing my presentation, the issue is so much rich and deeper than that, and I have to touch on more subjects than I promised that. So I have to, I will deal with the modal status, but I will also deal with other issues that da Costa's approach require. Just to mention that the issue goes much deeper than that, and I'm not even far of touching the full complexity of the discussion that da Costa does. So this is basically not as I wish it would be. It's not as focused on the modal status, but for good reasons, I think. I hope you enjoy it. So my theme is on the approach by Newton da Costa on the modal status of logic. So in his book, the Ensaios sobre os Fundamentos da Lógica, da Costa defends a philosophy of logic that is quite ambitious. He has some quite interesting claims about logic there. As I see it by reading it again, da Costa advanced a version of anti-exceptionalism about logic as it is being discussed today. The view that da Costa was advancing there is now being called anti-exceptionalism. So da Costa was already defending this kind of view. That is basically a view that logic is not different from empirical science, at least in nature. It is basically more general than empirical science, but when you apply logic, it's just similar to empirical science. It's not different. And da Costa does that basically by using the same kind of characterization of logic that current anti-exceptionalism uses, that is, by denying the traditional features of logic. Da Costa denies that logic is a priori, that it is general, and that it is necessary. Well, I'm not sure that everyone today that adopts anti-exceptionalism denies that logic is general or necessary, but they typically deny that logic is a priori. So da Costa makes a denial of everything, of all those traditional positions. And what is interesting and totally related to the theme of the conference is that da Costa claims that reason, rationality, can only be achieved by applying some system of logic, although reason is not identical to any particular system of logic. So although logic is required, he will attempt to argue that no particular reason is identical to, no particular system of logic is identical to reason. So basically reason has no principle of logic of its own. And that's part of his claim to deny all these features of logic and the necessity of logic. So the problem, I shall focus on da Costa's motivations for those claims and basically for denying the necessity of the laws of logic. And I would like to focus, as I mentioned in my abstract, on something he does, is the use of hypothetical models or thought experiments in logic, which is an issue that is quite underdeveloped and that da Costa made a good use of already in the 80s. I think he's one of the first, as I know, to use these thought experiments as a tool of logic. So basically, da Costa thinks that logic is not necessary, or no principle of logic is necessary, and he ties this failure to failure of generality. So logic is not necessary because there is always some context or some region where these principles fail. So not being general, they are not necessary. They do not apply everywhere. And this leads him to the following claim, which is quite interesting. He calls it the norm of relativity. He says there is almost no logical principle that cannot be brought into question, in the sense that there is a reasonable logical system in which it does not hold. So this is a translation. All the translations are mine. They are not quite good, but well. So this norm of relativity is a quote by Costa. He claims that almost all logical principle can be brought into question, and he demands that the system of logic that brings the principle into question be reasonable. So that's 2 points that we shall discuss. What does it mean by reasonability here? And it's related to the overall view of logic that Da Costa has. So basically, what I'll try to do is to ground his claim on the norm of relativity. Why does he believe that? Because then this will bring the failure of generality and, as a consequence, the failure of necessity. So basically, the first step consists in defining how, or presenting how Da Costa understands those terms. That is generality, necessity, and of course, a priori, because this will be the key to understanding the failure of generality and necessity, and to the use of the thought experiments. This is all related. That's why I mentioned that I could not focus only on necessity. So basically, Da Costa thinks that a priori has this traditional meaning that logic would be a priori if it could be independent of experience. This is quite in line with current anti-exceptionalist characterization of logic not being a priori. As Jortland has put quite recently, when we reject the a priority of logic, we are left with a less glamorous alternative. Basic logical knowledge is as hard-earned as the knowledge of physics, chemistry, or economics. The fortunes of logic are no less tied to a priori evidence than other sciences. In Quine's phrase, logic is as revisable as natural sciences. So this is basically very much in line with Da Costa's approach to logic. So he thinks that logic is not a priori in this sense. Logic is dependent on experience. So if logic were a priori, it would hold in every possible context. It would not be dependent on experience, and perhaps some principle of logic could be part of reason. So in order to avoid that there is any principle of logic that may be part of reason, he has to grant that logic is not a priori. That's part of his strategy. So the next major concept is generalism, or the generality of logic. Logic is thought to be general because its laws, it is said, apply in every context or in every situation. Routley characterizes logic like that. He says, logic is not merely a local matter and should, insofar as it is correct, apply universally. Shapiro recently did the same. He said logic is ubiquitous. There is a long-standing view with a stellar pedigree that logical consequence is topic neutral. It applies everywhere. And even if that is challenged, it remains that every coherent perspective, every language, every form of life, every context has a logic. So logic is general in two senses. In the sense that there is a system that applies everywhere, and in the sense that logic as a science applies everywhere. So basically, Da Costa would deny the first characterization that there is a system applying everywhere, although he agrees that everywhere a logic will apply. In every context, there will be a logic, but there is no logic for every context. So logic as a science is general, but no system of logic is general, in the sense that it applies everywhere. So he denies generalism in this restricted sense, that it does not apply everywhere. And now the modal status. The necessity of logic is associated, of course, with the idea that logical laws are infallible, that they do not hold everywhere. So the failure of the necessity, of course. So the failure of the necessity of logic means that it is possible to find some situation or context where this laws fail, or at least for every single law, one can find a context where this law fails. And Da Costa makes a very nice remark about the soundness theorem for classical logic, where he mentions that intuitively the theorem will say that a law of classical logic, if something is a law of classical logic, it holds in every interpretation, and that means that it holds basically in every possible world, and so it is necessary. And in order to violate the necessity of logic, he says, well, so we must reverse that. Basically, to show that the logical laws are not necessary, we must find a context, an interpretation where these laws fails. So failure of modality, of the modal status, of the necessity of logic is directly related to failure of generality. And as we shall see, is directly connected with the claim that logic is not a priori. There is a kind of unity in this, the failure of the three general classical aspects of logic. So basically, the target that Da Costa sets in his terms is this one. He puts it as follows. According to classical authors, when we analyze the different scientific disciplines, we observe that there are certain formal norms that are always respected. Human spirit, although it applies to the most varied fields, remains constant, so that the laws of reason, the supreme logical principles, must be invariant. Whichever is the reason for this invariance, either the nature of reason or the metaphysical constitution of the world, it is a fact for a traditional logician. For the latter, in brief, there was only one logical system which condensed the formal laws for a legitimate use of reason. So this is basically a characterization of the topic neutrality of logic, according to Da Costa. He puts it in the terms of human spirit, and this is a quite odd terminology, but the plan is that reason remains fixed or invariant, and what varies is the non-logical information that one gets. So every single context is observed, as it were, by a single logical glass. So the traditional view is this one. We have one logic that is given beforehand, and with this kind of tool or lenses, we observe the peculiarities of every particular context. And so the logic keeps fixed. And this is the way that Da Costa frames the view that logic is both a priori, general, and necessary. It is not to be reached by any of the idiosyncrasies of experience, because it's safe from experience by being brought along with reason beforehand. So, although this is a lot of things, let me try to put it all together to frame a kind of general picture. The plan is that as a result of this constancy of reason, this reason being the same in all contexts, the laws codified by traditional logic are brought by human reason a priori. The traditional logic is part of reason, they characterize reason, and they apply everywhere. And as a result, they are general and necessary. And in order to revert this picture, Da Costa suggests that we should resist generality. If it is possible that a given law fails in a context, then it results that the law itself is not necessary. And to provide for a failure of generality, Da Costa appeals to a failure of the a priority of logic. So basically, if logic is not a priori, if it's not independent of experience and not a permanent component of reason, then there's a sense in which logic does depend on experience. And if that is the case, then different logics, different kinds of objects could, at least in principle, be governed by distinct logics. So that's the plan. The plan is that reason does not address reality, as it were, already with logical principles, but it goes to experience to look for logical principles. And if there are different kinds of objects, then there will be different kinds of logics to govern these objects. So basically, reason has no principles, and it only gets principles after it has looked for the objects, and this comes from experience. I need some more terminology now, because that's how reason enters the game. Becker Costa establishes a kind of connection between reason, language, and reality, as described in a scientific context. So reason, rationality, articulates itself in linguistic terms, and these terms, the linguistic categories that we use, are at least in part obtained with the help of experience. And at the same time, they reflect the workings of reality. So there is a parallel between rationality, language, and reality. And reason is basically the sum of two components. There is a static component, which is constitutive reason. This is a quite Kantian inspiration by the Costa. Reason has this static part of constitutive reason, which provides us the categories that are basic to reason, like object, property, relation, space, and time. And there is also a more dynamic part, the operative reason, which operates on the categories to combine these concepts and make inferences. So from the basis of constitutive reason, one gets new information with operative reason. This may seem quite strange to speak of reason and the human spirit, but there is a direct linguistic part of that, if you prefer, that these aspects of reason are directly reflected in the syntactical terms we use in language. Basically, language reflects the working of reason in its syntactical categories. And Da Costa says that it is clear that syntactical genres such as term, predicate, and atomic sentence corresponds to the rational categories of object, relation, and fact. In general, the syntactical genres explicit the fundamental logical categories of constitutive reason. So, to know reality, the constitutive reason employs as a reference system the logical categories which are explicit by the syntactical genres of T. So T is a formal language that is discussing. So basically, reason makes use of a language, and there is a complete parallel between the syntactical categories of objects, predicates, and the workings of reason. And this all connects to reality. I'm sorry if I am presenting a lot of different terminology, but I hope that it will make a lot of sense. It makes for a coherent picture, and it helps on Da Costa's attack on this generality of logic, and in his establishing this norm of relativity that we started with, which is, I think, one of his goals. So how does this connect to reality? He says, well, to know reality and systematize our sensations, constitutive reason looks for help in the categories, among which there are those that correspond more or less directly to structural features of reality, or at least it seems so, such as the categories of object, predicate, and fact. So, you see, these categories of object, predicate, and facts are in reason. They are used to systematize experience, and they reflect themselves in language through the workings of some syntactic genres. So, overall, then, the basic categories of object, predicate, and relation, and fact, have correspondence both in reality and in language. So they reflect one the work of another. And experience helps us shape the content of such categories and their more general contours, and also the kind of inference that we can derive from them. So again, the general picture. By allowing that the categories may be shaped by experience, so that distinct categories of objects may require distinct behaviors of such categories, Da Costa opens the door for experience to help regulate logic. So that's basically his major point on denying the a priority of logic. That is, given that we have this rational category of object and that it must mirror experience, and that experience may provide us with distinct kinds of objects behaving very differently, then depending on the kind of object, one will have a different behavior for the notion of object, and also for the logic governing the syntactical category of objects, and also for predicates and facts. So different regions or kinds of objects, as described by the distinct contexts, will be allowed to demand different behaviors of the categories, and as a consequence of the logic. So basically the Costa's view on rationality, language, and reality, the connection of this is that reason is basically a formal machinery. It's empty of any principles, and when it wants to know how to operate, it applies these general categories of object, predicate, fact to experience in order to derive some information on how to proceed. So experience provides the content of this formal machinery, and then the kind of logic that one gets depends on this kind of information that is provided by experience. So that's why in the first slide I mentioned it, that reason identifies with no logic, because no logic could already be there to regulate how the objects are going to be. That's not up to reason, that's up to reality to tell us. So reason would be having first principles already there, and it would disturb the way we check how experience affects the categories. That's the other way around for Da Costa. No, reason only has the bare categories, and then experience gives us the information on how to proceed. So as Da Costa put it, reason is not self-sufficient. The system of logic reflecting its workings depends on experience, varying in conformity with the kinds of object to which it applies. So basically, experience informs reason, and that information appears in the working of language. So language expresses how reason is proceeding. That's why there is this triple general working. So this is what will be put to use against the necessity of logic and to ground the norm of relativity. So basically, if contexts that provide us this information are so homogeneous as to give rise to the same kinds of objects all the time, then of course there is only one kind of rule that will be appropriate for these objects. It could be that there is only one kind of object. On the other hand, if a varied set of contexts can be provided with the more distinct kinds of objects behaving in wildly different ways, always giving rise to distinct logics, then there is evidence that the content of the categories is dependent on such contexts and not the other way around. So what Da Costa does is, on the wake of the plurality of systems of logic, to allow the distinct logical behavior be enabled by distinct objectual behavior or empirical behavior, making the categories quite flexible and relative to the contexts. So if the contexts are going to inform us about the behavior of objects, the crucial question is, can we grant that there are contexts enough to ground the norm of relativity? That is, if we need to be informed by experience to have a logical behavior, and there's this claim that almost every logical principle can be brought into question, basically, to ground this claim, one must provide contexts in enough quantity and diversity that can grant that in such contexts the required laws fail. So there must be a wide diversity of contexts to make this kind of, to provide the input for reason that will give us the appropriate logic. So that is, if logic depends on experience, and we want to show that there is always a logic that bring into question a certain principle, then we must be able to provide a context doing precisely that. And how can Da Costa grant that there is always a context that will allow us to somehow falsify or bring into question a principle? This is where the methodology of the hypothetical models gets in. And this is part of something that Da Costa calls scientific philosophy, which is quite interesting. Basically, the scientific philosopher is more or less a naturalist, and he addresses the philosophical problems with the same kind of attitude as the scientists. He only analyzes science, but scientific philosophy does not have problems of its own. So it does not have problem of universals or problems, specific problems that are from scientific philosophy. No, scientific philosophy feeds on science. The problem is to get science clear. And there is another remark by Costa that the investigation must be objective. So it must be independent of political and religious biases. He thinks it's important to emphasize that. I just thought it was nice to mention it here. And now what's relevant for us is the method of the scientific philosopher, the tools that are used, because the scientific philosopher makes analysis of language, appeal to results or evidence from special sciences, in particular physics and physiology, mathematics, appeal to evidence based on historical cases, so that is also open for the philosopher, and the use of hypothetical models. Basically, Costa thinks that using hypothetical models is a tool that scientists use. So he mentions the example of Poincaré providing for models of non-Euclidean geometry, and Einstein with his elevator model. So they are hypothetical, and they help us get the situation clearer. And this is basically what shall concern us here to answer the question of whether there are enough contexts to bring into question every possible law of logic, because you may now already see where it's going to lead us. So Costa says, the method of models is of such a great help in cases of clarifying some intricate conceptions, as well as a process to develop counterexamples to grant that some positions we adopt, consciously or unconsciously, are devoid of reasons. So basically, of course, it helps us bringing some intricate conceptions in more familiar terms. Perhaps that's what Einstein and Poincaré were doing. And also to develop counterexamples. And basically, I think he had in mind here, I didn't ask him, but he had in mind here the idea that we may think that some principle of logic is necessary, that it has no counterexample, it cannot fail. And well, if you cannot find an actual counterexample, you may provide for a hypothetical model where that fails. So that's the answer to get the appropriate contexts. Recall what were our problem. If logic is related to experience, it's governed by the kind of behavior that given objects have in given contexts. And we want to grant that there are contexts in a variety enough to bring into question practically every law of logic, then we must have available enough contexts. And basically, this is what the hypothetical models can help us achieving, because whenever there is no clear counterexample for a given law, we may produce one hypothetically. So this is the nice use of hypothetical models or thought experiments in logic. They are conceived to dislodge any principle that would attempt to be grounded in reason, to come with reason to check or judge or make any other context possible. No, there is nothing in reason that is a principle of logic, because basically no principle of logic applies to every context. So reason is empty of logical principles. It has only a very meager machinery. So, and how does that relate to the feature to the fact that logic is not a priori? Basically, can you see my mouse? Yes. So basically, because of this, because Costa thinks that hypothetical models are in fact experience conceived in a broad sense. So they are also part of the empirical attempt to derive logic. I know that Otávio will complain perhaps about that, but Costa takes it that, well, hypothetical models are just a broad notion of experience. So logic is still dependent on experience if we take these hypothetical models. So let me present to you the three examples that Costa uses of hypothetical models, which I think are quite interesting, and how he puts it to use to violate what he calls the traditional principles, or the basic principles that are the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. He does not attempt to do it to every principle of logic. That's why I think he was so careful in his formulation of the norm of relativity. And although he is not that careful in other parts of the book, he says that basically everything can be brought into question in logic. So I guess that Décio has already spoken in this seminar, and he spoke about Schrödinger logics and crazy sets theory. So anyway, I will revive it. Perhaps not everyone has seen it. And the first remarkable use of hypothetical models concerns the Costa attempt at violation of the principle of identity. And it's basically the Schrödinger logic. He begins with a quotation by Schrödinger that is now famous whenever one reads a paper on Schrödinger logic and non-reflexive logic, because it appears quite a lot as a motivation for these systems. And Schrödinger basically said, I beg to emphasize this, and I beg you to believe it. It is not a question of our being able to ascertain the identity in some instances and not being able to do so in others. It is beyond doubt that the question of sameness of identity really and truly has no meaning. So basically, Schrödinger is claiming that in quantum mechanics, identity does not apply in some cases. And da Costa takes it as a motivation that to bring into question the principle of identity, that for every object S, X equal X fails. Of course, Schrödinger is not mentioning any specific law of identity. He's mentioning identity, but that's enough for the law of identity to fail too, it seems, at least for da Costa. So the plan for da Costa here is basically to develop a two-sorted first-order logic with quantifiers, the typical connectives, but with two kinds of individual terms. Let me call the classical variables and the classical individual constants, and non-classical variables and non-classical individual constants. And he connects the non-classical terms with quantum particles, the classical terms with classical objects, and he restricts the principle of identity by defining formula as applying only to classical variables, not to non-classical variables. So for non-classical entities, represented by the non-classical terms, identity is not well formed, so it does not make sense to say that they are identical or different. And this is a restriction on the law of identity. So in this context, identity does not apply in general. So what is achieved by da Costa with this? He says, well, from an empirical science, and this is what is quite specific to this model, one obtains the possibility of a situation where a law of logic fails, the law of identity. And by elaborating on this possibility, one develops the Schrödinger logic, a system where one can reason about entities without identity. And one has even an informal semantics for this logic based in quantum mechanics. And if this logic is reasonable, and da Costa thinks it is, the law of identity fails in this context. And so it is not an a priori ingredient of reason. It does not hold of necessity. It is something that must be informed by the context. And this context is informing reason that identity is restricted. And what is hypothetical about it? One could claim, well, that's a dispute about real quantum mechanics. What's hypothetical about it is that da Costa concedes that Schrödinger logic is not required for quantum mechanics. This is not the logic that quantum mechanics really uses, because people use classical logic in quantum mechanics. So what is hypothetical about it is the possibility that one could understand quantum mechanics as a context where the law of identity does not hold. It's a kind of a leave option or a possible context. So although we do use classical logic, there is another context where the law of identity fails. And the choice of classical logic that Costa mentioned is based on pragmatic grounds. And so it is not based on the necessity of the law of identity. It is chosen for convenience. The Costa says, well, reason has a preference for older principles. It will attempt to be as conservative as possible. So instead of rejecting identity, people prefer to keep identity. The point is that hypothetically there is another option. And that's what makes this a use of the hypothetical model strategy. So the classical law of identity can be violated. Da Costa uses also the law of excluded middle. The point here is quite interesting because as a scientific philosopher, it is a fact for him that the law of excluded middle fails in some contexts. It's enough to check that there is intuitionistic logic and mathematics. So there is a place where intuitionistic logic is really applied and used. So there's no question about it. So there's not even the need to use hypothetical models. So he says, well, for those trying to contest or to deny that intuitionistic logic is really a logic or is a legitimate application of a logic, he says, the underlying logic of rational contexts is the one that is really employed in such contexts, and not a logic that is imposed from the outside for reasons that are extrinsic to the context. In other words, intuitionistic logic is the definitive proof that there are logics differing from the traditional one, which are useful and which are effectively employed. So that's the point about intuitionistic logic. It is effectively employed. So there is no denying it. However, I mentioned it because Da Costa also presents a hypothetical model for the failure of excluded middle. Basically, he creates a science that does not exist. He calls it semiography. And semiography is defined as the constructive study of symbolic configurations. Basically, one is interested in combine symbols and their configuration, the properties of these configurations, and study it from a constructive point of view. In these terms, as Da Costa puts it, a configuration exists if and only if it can be constructed, which means that it can be written as a sequence of symbols. And he says, if we want to develop semiography coherently in a purely constructive way, the logic that imposes itself is intuitionist. So if someone does not believe in intuitionistic mathematics, there is still a hypothetical example of another science which can be provided as a context where the law of excluded middle would fail. That's part of the role of semiography in Da Costa's discussion. Basically, Da Costa wants to show that if one does not believe Brouwer, one can still motivate intuitionistic logic independently of Brouwer's restrictions on mathematics. So basically, the study of symbols is quite simple. It's quite independent of Brouwer's idiosyncrasies. So the use of hypothetical models appears there too. Now for the third example, non-contradiction and paraconsistency. Well, Da Costa, this is quite curious because while having created paraconsistent logics, Da Costa somehow admits that some of the motivations are quite philosophical. They are philosophical system of dialectics, Meinongian theory of objects, and it would be quite good if some scientific context could also use paraconsistency. And Da Costa, at the same time, he also observes that, well, the mere existence of paraconsistent logics is already evidence that the law of non-contradiction fails. So sometimes he thinks that only a formal system is enough. And sometimes he says, no, there must be a context where some kind of object requires that logic. So I think that this is part of the constraint on the norm of relativity. The system must be reasonable, must be applied, required by something. So one should be able to provide a context where the law of non-contradiction fails. The problem is that science, as it currently is, I will skip this quite more fast, yeah, is that science, as it currently is, does not require that we violate the law of contradiction. The observable world is concrete. The concrete world is consistent. I'm sorry. There are no observable contradictions, at least for the Costa. And whenever we derive contradictions, they are either with abstract objects or with things that are not observable. And typically, science attempts to eliminate those contradictions. So a scientific philosopher should not take some contradictions in science as a proof that it needs paraconsistent logic. Although the Costa has a quite deep discussion on that too. In order to fix that, he presents a hypothetical model, the Wittgenstein world, that's based on von Freud's description. Basically, a Wittgenstein world is a world where one distributes truth values to the basic propositions, and there is a change in the world when one proposition changes from truth to falsity or from falsity to truth. So if one supposes that time may be indefinitely divisible, and that there is a proposition that varies every time that time is divided, one gets a contradictory world. It is enough to consider two intervals of time, k1 and k2, so that if there is a change of time, there is a change of proposition. P, for instance, changes to not P. But given that time is divisible, one can break it and then find another division where P changes to not P, and break it again, and then not P changes to P. And in the middle of this interval, P keeps changing between P and not P all the time, or at least a lot of times. And in order to describe this, we need a paraconsistent logic, because P and not P will be true, at least in the larger interval. This is the basic idea of the Wittgenstein world, and this crazy theory of time that appears there with this crazy behavior of this proposition. So in this world, the logic would have to be paraconsistent. So what the Costa thinks that such hypothetical models provide? They provide examples, refuting the three basic laws, and that's all that he wishes. The situations, of course, they are quite different, because it seems that the law of excluded middle is quite surely violated in actual practice, in the actual intuitionist mathematics, and the other cases were more hypothetical. Of course, in the case of Schrödinger logic, the hypothesis comes from science too, but it's not actual science, it is a deviation of actual science. But the LMC, the law of non-contradiction, was really an artificial example that was cooked up to provide a counterexample. So that's the role of the hypothetical models in this philosophy. They provide for a kind of empirical basis and the required context where the laws fail. And if these laws fails in this context, they are not general, they are not part of the of reason. The reason must be fed by the context, and then they are not general, not universal. This is how Da Costa uses this quite interesting methodological tool for violating necessity of logic. So now I'll go very briefly in some remarks about how this works. I am coming to an end, don't worry. So there is I think that there is a major difficulty. If you didn't agree with the use of hypothetical model, I think, let me show you what I think are the problems on that. Because Da Costa takes it that the failure of such laws makes logic quite similar to empirical science. Given that the laws of logic are not necessary, adoption of a law is always provided on a hypothetical basis. It is always a kind of unsafe adoption, because these laws are not necessary. Adoption of a law of logic is like adoption of a geometry. It's made for pragmatic reasons. So the laws are always adopted on pragmatic grounds. That's what makes him quite close to current anti-exceptionalism, or at least that's what makes current anti-exceptionalists quite close to Da Costa, because he was doing this before. And of course, Quine did it even before, but Da Costa takes that the lesson of this whole journey on the non-necessity of logic to be this feature of the laws of logic. They are all hypothetical. The problem, at least as I see it, is that Da Costa seems to mix two things that are that should be separated. One thing is the adoption of a logic, and the other thing is the logic of a context. I would like to observe that if the logic of a context is always hypothetical and could always be different, then the use of hypothetical models to dismiss the validity of a law is less than certain. If one can always say, well, yes, law of identity fails in Schrödinger logics, but even so, this failure is only hypothetical, it's not quite certain. Then all the force of the hypothetical models will be lost. I mean, if the hypothetical models are to work, then the scenarios they provide must really provide for counterexamples to the laws. So the laws cannot be hypothetical in those contexts. They must really hold in those contexts. Otherwise, there is not really a necessary failure of the laws. So the scenarios, they must provide really the failure of the law under discussion. They are created precisely for the purpose of the failure. So in those contexts of the hypothetical models, a law cannot be only hypothetical, as Da Costa thinks. The law must fail for sure. Otherwise, we would not be bothered to create that models to begin with. And I think that the point is granted by Da Costa. Consider semiography. He defined semiography as the constructive study of symbolic configurations. It is basically defined in intuitionistic terms. A symbolic configuration exists only if it can be constructed. So it was constructed to hold with intuitionistic logic. So intuitionistic logic holds for sure there, by definition. And so in that context, logic must be intuitionistic. So I think that these are the two things that Da Costa mixes here in his discussion. One thing is that a law should hold in a context for certain. And another thing is that this law does not hold in every context. So in some contexts, some laws are really required, just like in semiography or in Schrödinger logics. It is really required that identity fails. And even in the Wittgenstein world, it is required that the law of non-contradiction fails. Otherwise, that would not be a counterexample to this law. So what is going wrong, I think, is that I will skip this. Basically, Da Costa is confusing these two levels. One thing is which logic we adopt, and the other thing is the logic of a context. Basically, the logic of a context must be fixed. And the logic we adopt, of course, is a pragmatical matter. For whatever task we have, we may use a logic for pragmatical matters. And the source of this confusion, I'll have to skip because I am already very late, is that Da Costa is taking two different notions of context. I think he's switching between different notions. Classically, what Da Costa warned us against is that the context is a fixed logic plus the context relative information. And hypothetical models seems to work only if we adopt the definition of a context as a logic and the relative context, the relative information. But however, Da Costa also understands context in his a priori approach to logic as requiring that the context give rise to a logic. This is what I call the Einsteinian view of context. because Einstein said it is the theory that determines what you observe. So the theory comes first, even the logic. So in the context we create by the hypothetical model, the logic is already put there by hand. So it must be there. It cannot fail, otherwise there would not be a context where such and such a logic fails. However, Da Costa also adopts the Sherlock Holmes approach to context, which is basically, he says, well, collect your data first and then make your theory. So, and then we will have first the information of the context and then we will look for the theory. So there is this kind of double approach to contexts. They keep swinging uncomfortably between these two definitions. And to grant that logic is only hypothetical, we need this definition of context. To grant that the hypothetical models work, we need this definition of context. And of course, to make all this more precise, we need a very good definition of a context, and that is what is lacking. And that is my conclusion. That's not a solution, that's a problem. So thank you. These are the references. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Jonas. You already have a question. So Andres,
yes.
Speak, please.
Who's going to question? Otávio?
Yes, Andres.
Andres.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It has been very illustrating for me and have pointed out why I don't agree with Da Costa in a very deep sense. And now I realize you have shown it to me. And that is what I will call the scientificist position of Da Costa, somehow related with Bunge's view. And for me has been a big problem, the idea that science will solve these kind of problems. And that's, for me, is quite interesting. So it's very interesting to see the point that is in the book, of course, I know very well. And saying that, I know Otávio is going to publish in Synthesis the book in English. Janip's already published it in French. And let me suggest, Luis Felipe, you can make a translation to Spanish. And that will be quite interesting. And we can find a printing house in somewhere that will print this book. I think it will be quite interesting because it's not in Spanish. So that's a general point to make. And I want to make one comment that is in the book of Lukasiewicz of 1910 about the principle of non-contradiction, not in the article, because the article was published in German, but I'm talking about the book that was published at the same time, is 200 pages. Lukasiewicz has a thought experiment about contradictions. And I think it's quite interesting. It's not in the paper, and I don't know if this book has been published in other languages. I have one German edition, and I don't know if the book itself, sometimes I heard that was going to be translated, but there is the Polish and the German translation. But he proposed the idea of an island where all false statements are, I consider valid. It holds all false statements. And there will be some statement that the affirmative case will be the case. And in that situation, you will have a situation where contradictions will happen. Well, I'm not explaining it very well now, but the idea is that there is this island where you will have, when you have a contradiction, when you say something positive, that is positive against negative statement. When you have something positive, then you will have a contradiction. That was just a point to make a historical remark. And this is my question. I didn't get so much why, because I don't remember, why the semiography logic will have to be intuitionist. And as far as I understood, it was related with the constructivist part of it. And it's because intuitionist is part of constructivism. But I think every constructive view has to be intuitionistic. I don't know if you could explain more than that, because yes, of course, intuitionist is part of constructivist, but not a constructivist is intuitionist. That's my question.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. Indeed, on your suggestion on Lukashevich, thank you very much. Da Costa mentions also that Vasiliev already used a kind of thought experiment in his imaginary logic. And I think that the positive part of his approach is that he brings it clearly into the methodology of logical investigation. So very nice that Lukashevich also did it. And on the part of the semiography, basically, there is no discussion by Da Costa of why it must be precisely intuitionistic logic. It is related with the constructive character of these symbolic combinations, and with this characterization of existence of as a combination in terms of construction. But of course, given that Da Costa does not develop it in full details and merely claims that it will have to be intuitionistic logic, I took it for granted that it is enough to violate the law of excluded middle, but not. He does not discuss why it must be precisely intuitionistic logic. So it's more an stipulation than.
Yeah, but being constructive leads to violate the excluded middle. Why?
Oh, basically because of restrictions on the existential quantifier and on what one can really construct. You have to be able to construct certain consequences, certain sequences, symbolic sequences, combinations, and it's not granted that for any property of a symbolic combination you will be able to construct it or show that it's not possible to construct it. It's basically in the same sense that intuitionism, I think. That's why Da Costa took it quite fast, I guess.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, there are not really many details about the science that does not exist yet, but Da Costa invented it for an example. So I think it's more a stipulation than really an investigation.
And why is not semiology? Why is not semiology? Why is so different to semiology?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Otávio.
Thank you, Andres.
Yeah, let me. I have. Well, first of all, Jonas, I love the paper, and it's a really careful study of Newton's book, and I thought you offer a very sympathetic and illuminating account of what he did in the book. And first, can you send me the slides in the paper once you have them as well?
Sure.
I really like. Now, one quick comment about Andres' questions. I think when Newton was insisting that the logic in semiology is constructive, his point there is when he was concerned with the syntax of logic, right? We need to build we need to have enough symbols and rules of formation in a language so that we can then talk about logic in any sensible manner. And he thought that to do that, the process had to be constructive because he's now considering what are the requirements for that little language to be built. So I think there were good reasons to use a constructive logic there, right? And as he highlighted. Now, with regard to your question or your criticisms at the end, right? And I think Newton would probably highlight that given the emphasis on a scientific philosophy approach that he has, of course, a term that comes from Rochambeau, and although I think Newton's model was probably Carnap more than Rochambeau, and when we have, I think he will acknowledge the fallibility of any failure of a logical principle. So, and that's the same thing with any falsification of a scientific theory, right? There are no absolute falsifications of scientific theories. You falsify a theory by running certain experiments and showing that one of the consequences of the theory is false. But those experiments have assumptions, right? And you can always challenge the experiment and the assumptions that go into it, right? In which case you have to revise your falsification, right? That's exactly the same thing will go. We create, in the case of logic, right? You have a model that you're considering in which a certain logical principle fails. If that happens, of course, whatever assumptions that go into the construction of that model, if they are denied, well, then the counterexample will not go through, right? And I don't think that in that sense, he needs to have any more than just a pragmatic commitment to whatever principles that are being invoked to construct those models, right? And everything is up for revision as needed. And if you say, look, sorry, in this particular model that you're considering, you are illegitimately assuming such and such logical principle that it's questioned, the application of it is questionable in exactly that context, well, that will be a reason to say, well, we need a different counterexample, right? So I'm not sure that he needs any more than a pragmatic commitment to any of the logical principles, right? Now, one thing that I also like just to comment, I don't remember Newton's making in the Ensayo the distinction between pure and applied logic. But this is a big distinction for him that later, in his later writings, he would emphasize. And I think that's also, that may affect some of the discussions that he had in the book, if you look back at the book in the light of that distinction, right? Because when earlier in your talk, you presented Newton's discussion of, look, in order to refute or show the failure of a logical principle, we need to show an alternative system in which it fails. This is probably more than it's needed just to falsify a logical principle. As you pointed out elsewhere in the book itself, he acknowledges that sometimes all it's needed is just to have a counterexample, right? And that might be enough, right? So to show that certain principles do not go through, right? Why do we need, in addition, to actually devise an alternative system in which the principle does not hold, right? It seems to me that those are two different requirements on the failure of a logical principle. Presumably, a counterexample would be enough, right? So if you consider fictional objects and you say, well, it's undetermined that whether they have or not certain properties, that seems enough to undermine the principle of excluded middle. Now you say, and of course, you can undermine the principle by showing here's an entire logic that does not require that principle. Okay, that's a different way, perhaps a more demanding way of undermining a principle. But it seems to me that both in principle should be allowed. And if you think in terms of the distinction between pure and applied logics, right? For pure logics, a straight counterexample would be enough. For applied logic, for pure logics, well, then you need to devise the entire system, right, of logic to undermine a principle. So it seems that might help sort of coordinate his ideas on that score. But I really like the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Otávio. A lot of different questions, and let me try to address them. First, I think that Costa does the distinction on pure and applied logic. He does not do it explicitly, but he mentions, for instance, that classical logic as pure logic is perfect as it is. One cannot really bring it to question. However, logic is only hypothetical when applied to reality. So then it becomes just like geometry. It's a matter of pragmatic choice, so of convenience. And so the distinction is there, and sometimes he uses it very heavily. And I think I have separated some pages where he does it. Yes, these pages of the Portuguese edition of the 80s, where he mentions this hypothetical character of logical laws when applied to reality. So, and then in other places he mentions, no, pure logic is just perfect. One cannot call into question because there's nothing there to call into question. And at the same time, I see your point on the fallibility of a logical law in a counterexample, because it makes, of course, perfect sense. I think perhaps the Costa could use it, but in some passages he does require that, he seems to require that this fallibility is really provided by the counterexamples when he characterizes the hypothetical models, and when he characterizes the method of hypothetical models, and he provides these hypothetical models. I'm sorry, I went just too fast in the end because I saw that my time was already out. It's my fault, of course. But my point was that when Da Costa characterizes the context, he's already using logic in them implicitly, because otherwise they would not work as counterexamples. So that's this issue with semiography that we are discussing. He characterizes it as constructive, and this requires him that he sees the context as having a constructive reading of the existential quantifier and of negation. So that's why the failure of excluded middle is sort of put there by hand. Well, because he already twists the context so that it is a context dealt with by intuitionistic logic, at least when he stipulates it. There's this minor issue that we are discussing here. And the same holds for the Wittgenstein world, because if one is allowed to try to check the logic afterwards, so provide the model and then check whether the logic is really classical or paraconsistent, then we'll probably have a disagreement on what's going on, because a classical logician will see those contradictions here. We say, well, P and not P are holding, so it's explosive. This is not even to be considered. And that's not how Da Costa wants it to be seen. He wants to say, you see, there's P and there's no P, and this is really a coherent world. It's not explosive. So somehow paraconsistency is already there. So in a sense, one must provide some kind of, that's why the hypothetical model approach is so important. One provides a kind of application. And that's why I try to emphasize in the norm of relativity the use of reasonable systems, because he mentions it in some passages. I was not careful enough to write them, where he says, well, it's not just a formal system. It has an application, just as he does for intuitionism, for instance. He says, well, how can one deny it? There is intuitionistic mathematics. So if you deny it, you are being speculative. So I don't want to have anything to do with that. So I think that that's the importance. But of course, I see that it is not as established as I may be trying to advance here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Otávio.
Okay, thank you, Jonas.
Thank you, Jonas, for your talk. I really enjoy it. I have maybe just a very simple question. So it concerns the evidential role that these hypothetical models might play, and if there is, and the question is, if there is any kind of degree of this evidential or degrees of evidence that these hypothetical models provide, because it seems to me that in this broad category, you can place certain things that look like thought experiments, and that you are not, in a sense, manipulated or seen through which is going to be the result of the experiment, but you just let it go, and suddenly you get something novel or something new or something revealing, and that comes more like an evidence that if you have already a goal in mind and you are just trying to show how to get there. And also in this very broad category of hypothetical models, you can also have toy models, toy examples, right? And these toy examples might help to enable understanding or things like that, or convince the other parts, or make or clarify more notions and so on. But it's not so clear how strong the evidential role that they will play is going to be. So I was wondering if there is any distinction at hand or something like that.
Well, thank you, Maria. This is very nice. That's in part why I wanted to make this talk and connect it to the hypothetical models, because I'm interested in these questions in logic. I think that Da Costa does not address this distinction on the evidential power of distinct uses of the hypothetical models, because he is basically concerned in using them for counterexamples. But one kind of possibility is really to use them as toy models to investigate. As he mentions, one can use them to make some notions more familiar and to provide counterexamples to notions that we think are right. So I think they can be used as exploratory models and toy models, but then they are not to be understood as counterexamples to anything. So I think it will depend on the function that one uses them to. Basically, Da Costa is interested in using them as counterexamples. So perhaps some counterexamples will also be exploratory models to check if it's possible to separate some concepts, some notions, or to separate the behavior of a connective and, I don't know, to have certain truth conditions and whatever, to provide the most wild characterizations of things and check if they are possible. So to use really for exploratory work and not for these counterexamples, although I think they will overlap. So basically Da Costa is not clear on that, he's not interested on that, but I think that there is, it's quite open in his characterization also for these uses, and that's why what I am quite interested in, the further applications of this. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas.
Itala, please.
Jonas, many thanks. I liked very much the paper.
Thank you, Itala.
And enjoyed it very much. I wanted to reply to Andres, but Otavio did it much better than I could. And so I'm glad. But an information to Andres, the Łukasiewicz's book, the book published in Polish in 1910, yes, there is a translation into Italian. And a PhD student of Graham Priest prepared a translation of the book into English. The translation is ready. There are more or less 3 years, and the book was supposed to be published last year. But it seems that this didn't happen until now. But there is a translation, it's accepted for publication. The thesis of the guy is available at his university in Australia, but we don't have until now the published translation, but it will appear soon, I think.
Yeah, Itala, just a comment on this. Yes, we are waiting for the permissions. So I think there is some issue with the permissions that Heinz is working with to get the book published. So
it seems that there is a problem with the university, isn't it?
No, I think it's with the permissions for him to publish the translation. So
okay, it's a deeper problem. Okay,
so,
okay.
Well, that's my understanding.
Thank you.
But if it was published in German, could be published in other languages, I suppose.
No,
Yeah.
that's right. And but it's the permission from the German, because he translated from the German.
Not from the Polish.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But I said that there is a translation into Italian.
Yeah,
From the Polish.
Yeah.
Probably, yes. I think they're directly from Polish.
Thank you, Itala. So, Peter, please.
Yeah, I want
Can I ask
to
a
say
question?
that the way Da Costa uses thought experiment is called necessity refuters, and yes, about hypothetical models. I think logic, like mathematics, are always about idealizations, abstractions, symbolizations. Yeah, a question if you could call Newton Da Costa pragmaticist, and a second question: how about refuting the law of identity, for instance, by a thought experiment that Quine proposes, Gavagay. Yeah, if you see a rabbit, yeah, you talk with a native about it who doesn't speak English, and you say, what is it? Then maybe you could talk about all of the rabbit. Maybe you could talk about part of the rabbit. Maybe you could talk about the environment of the rabbit. Maybe you could talk about rabbithood, or maybe you could just want to say animal. So is Gavagay a good counterexample against the law of identity? And is Newton the Costa pragmaticist, do you think?
No, thank you. Da Costa considers himself to attach to pragmatism. In many cases, he describes himself as he adopts many principles that he calls pragmatic principles, and his approach is mainly pragmatical. Although in this book he adopts some positions that are he describes as realist and Platonic sometimes, but mostly he's a pragmaticist. And I don't think he would consider the example of Gavagay a good example, because of his scientific focus on these counterexamples. He thinks that the counterexamples must be focused on scientific contexts. So I'm not sure that he would really use this as this kind of thought experiment that I have been trying to mention. I'm really not sure of what he would say about it.
But it's scientific. It's scientific. It's a linguist who is investigating a new language, and he meets a native speaking this new language, and they are in a field, and he points to a rabbit. So I don't know why it's not. Why shouldn't it be scientific? It's intercultural communication, linguistic research.
No, sure, but I mean that it's not a kind of creation of a hypothetical model for a kind of scientific context. It could be a use of what Da Costa calls the, right in the beginning, of the method of language analysis.
Yeah, language analysis.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
So it would not be a use of hypothetical models.
Can I just
I think I agree. Yes.
Very briefly.
Yeah. Okay. It's also a hypothetical model, the thought experiment by Quine. But okay, thanks for the replies.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, Otávio.
It's just that it's not clear to me that the Gavagay case would challenge the law of identity, right? It's challenging the determinacy of reference. It's unclear whether the natives are referring to rabbit parts, rabbit stages, but it's not that they are saying that the rabbit is identical to things that are different from the rabbit, right? So I'm not sure that even if granting everything that was said, it's not clear that that would actually violate the principle of identity.
Well, just the question: what is a rabbit, or what is what is a rabbit? Is a rabbit its head or his body, or maybe rabbit hoods, or maybe all the rabbits, or maybe only this rabbit, particular rabbit, all the rabbits, rabbit hoods. Yeah, can mean all kind of things. Like meaning can have different meanings when you view from different points of view: Platonism, realism, conventionalism, and so on.
No, yeah, that's true, but that just means that the reference to rabbits is indeterminate. And so it's undecided on the basis of linguistic practice. Which of these things are we referring to just on the basis of our behavioral practice? So it's not that the rabbit itself is somehow not identical to itself. I think those are separate things.
But maybe all entities could be liable to indeterminacy of reference.
Yeah, all kinds of things could be. Yes, that's Quine's point of ontological relativity, right?
Yeah. So if there's ontological relativity, it's also not sure what is exactly T. What is T? Is T just one kind of T, or all kind of T's? Which kind of T?
Right.
If there's ontological relativity, there may or not be certainty on what is one entity anymore.
That's right. Yeah, the whole point is we cannot tell what the ontology is by giving a list of things, because the list of things requires individuation conditions for those things. And if you change those individuation conditions, the list will change. So, but that's a fact, that's a feature about how to formulate the ontology. It's not a claim about that the world is itself is somehow indeterminate. Of course, that's a separate issue. Right?